I'm delighted to be joined by Julie Lenarz, who is the Executive Director and founder of the Human Security Centre think tank. I suppose it's a think tank, is it? Is that fair to describe?
Yes, that's correct.
And a big sort of counter-extremism expert, and we're here to discuss Corbynism. So, I mean, I'll start with something quite basic. I mean, do you think that Britain would remain a reliable member of the Western Alliance if Corbyn becomes Prime Minister?
No, I wouldn't at all. And I think you're making a very critical point here from the start, because, you know, we often talk about Corbyn and Corbynism in the context of anti-Semitism, and of course that's critically important. He's clearly a threat to Jewish life in the UK. But Corbyn and Corbynism is not just a Jewish problem, he's a British problem, and that feeds into what you just said. And you can only imagine what this would do to our democracy at home, but also our standing in the world. And we already have seen the US saying if he became Prime Minister, they would seriously reconsider sharing with us critical, intelligent information because they don't think he can be trusted. They think he's a threat to national security. And it's also what we've heard from several of his own Labour MPs, and perhaps ex-Labour MPs, but they've openly said that he would be a threat to national security, and of course by that also to Britain's standing in the world.
So, presumably, if that's the case, then the special relationship with America is kind of out the window. Things like Five Eyes are under threat. It'd be a completely different security landscape.
Yes, of course. I mean, the US-UK relationship is an important relationship. It's a critical relationship. Some would say it's the most important relationship that we have, and that, by the way, is regardless of whoever is president at the moment. But it's not just the US. It's also, for instance, our allies in the Gulf, with who we cooperate quite a bit on anti-extremism in the Muslim world. Because imagine just the case, you have a prime minister who openly calls Hamas and Hezbollah his friends, and then at the same time we're lecturing our Arab allies about the need to confront extremism, and the UAE expelling Hamas and Jeremy Corbyn welcoming Hamas. I mean, you can only imagine how that would be, how that would look like, and how that would be perceived. So it wouldn't just put at risk the relationship with the EU, possibly with the United States, but also with critical allies that we have in the Arab world, and of course Israel as well.
I mean, do you think that Britain could, if Corbyn became Prime Minister, do you think that Britain could still be relied upon to honour its NATO obligations in terms of collective defence? And if not, could that potentially make Europe a less stable place?
Of course, yeah. I mean, we all know his views on NATO. I think you probably remember that when Slobodan Milosevic was committing genocide in the Balkan, that Corbyn was one of the MPs who signed a motion denying that very genocide and opposing a NATO intervention to bring that regime to an end. And this is something that we see in basically all of his foreign policy positions throughout the years, and that feeds into the wider context of his anti-Semitism, because he's not just an anti-Semite. His anti-Semitism is embedded in anti-Westernism. So if you look at Jeremy Corbyn's foreign policy record, you will find that basically he will side with whatever terrorist organization or whatever vile dictatorial regime, as long as they oppose whatever military action the West is taking. That let him going on Russian and Iranian state television making apologies for the Assad regime while they were dropping chemical bombs on little children. I mean, this is the bizarre world of Jeremy Corbyn. It's not just anti-Semitism, he's inherently anti-Western.
I mean, it's really interesting you mention that. When you say anti-Western, I mean, would you kind of define Western as believing kind of the liberal democratic capitalist way of organising human society?
Yes.
That's what Corbyn at core is opposed to. Because that suggests that he may have, how should I put it, slightly more radical views than perhaps he lets on, or that perhaps kind of like the Cold War far left mentality still very much affects him, and he still sees the liberal democratic capitalist model as the real enemy.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I mean, he and again that relates back to his anti-Semitism. Jeremy Corbyn and many of his far left ideologues, they believe that their ideology somewhat immunizes them to racism, right? They
Yeah.
believe that they are the true social justice warriors, and they are standing up to the most disenfranchised in the world, and celebrating communism. And of course, if you look at Venezuela and Cuba, you will see it's a very simplistic view of the world. But it also explains why he doesn't think, or possibly doesn't think, that he's an anti-Semite, because for him, Jews are not a persecuted minority. He thinks Jews are too white, they are too privileged, they are too rich, all of which, of course, is not true. But this is fundamentally the core of his ideology, and that, what you just said, his opposition to liberal Western democracy.
Yeah, I mean, going on for that, I mean, do you think that the centre... I presume the Corbyn can't really come to power without the connivance of the centre-left within the Labour Party and the British left more generally. Why do you think he's being offered that connivance? Why aren't the centre-left saying we want nothing to do with this guy?
Well, that is a very good question, right? Because we heard all the talk about fighting this from within, and not leaving the Labour Party to the hands of Jeremy Corbyn and his far left extremist ideologues. But if you look at the by-election in Peterborough, I think that's a very telling example. You will find that many of the so-called moderate MPs, who signed letters of solidarity with the Jewish community and say they stand up to anti-Semitism, actually going to Peterborough and campaigning for a candidate who's clearly said some horrible stuff and liked some horrible stuff. So that to me doesn't look like they're really taking on Jeremy Corbyn or Corbynism from within. That looks more like surrender, normalization, and if you look at the situation, the Labour Party will really find that this is what happened. Anti-Semitism has been normalised, and the Labour Party, unfortunately, now is an institutionally anti-Semitic party.
I mean, do you think there's any comparison between the Labour Party's capitulation to Corbynism and the Republican Party's capitulation to Trump in America?
I would say that in America the landscape is more complex because you have Trumpism on the one hand, and then you have the alt-right, and they don't necessarily get along with each other.
Yeah.
And then you have a clear opposition to Trump in the Republican Party. So it is a bit more complex, which doesn't.
It's less of a surrender.
Yes, which doesn't mean that the threat that we see, for instance, coming from the alt-right against Jews and other minorities isn't, a threat that we should address just as much as Corbynism in the UK. All I'm saying is it's a different country, it's a different political system, and you would need to differentiate that a little bit more.
I mean, do you think there's a lot of naivety? Obviously on the centre-left, but also on the centre, and even amongst some Conservatives, as to just how dangerous the far left can be. I mean, there's a tendency to kind of not hold them to quite the same moral standards as the far right. I mean, is that something you'd agree with?
Oh, absolutely. This is what I said before. Many on the left believe, especially on the far left, believe that their ideology somewhat immunizes them to racism. And when we talk about anti-Semitism and racism in general, many people automatically think about the far right.
Yeah.
And it is a real and potent threat. If you look at numbers across the European Union, hate crimes, racially motivated hate crimes, you will find that the far right is the very top there. But it doesn't mean that far-left extremism is any less dangerous. It is just as potent and dangerous as far-right extremism. And Jeremy Corbyn is the best example. If you look at how many Jews would genuinely consider their future in the country if he ever became Prime Minister, that is genuinely scary.
Yeah. I mean, turning back to something you mentioned earlier about kind of Corbynism being opposed to Western values, I mean, do you think there are some people, not necessarily Corbyn himself, but some people around Corbyn, obviously a number of his top advisors to former Communist Party people, were Communist Party people indeed until very recently. Do you think there are a number of people around Corbyn who are fundamentally, at best, have a conditional loyalty to kind of basic democratic values?
Not within his immediate surrounding. No, I mean, if you look at people like John McDonnell or Schumer Smile, all these people have their own track record of meeting with extremists. John McDonnell with the IRA, Schumer Smalin with Hamas. It's not just Jeremy Corbyn. He's part of a wider network of people that are fundamentally opposed to this worldview that we hold dear.
Yeah, so I think I badly phrased that question. What I was kind of trying to say is, do you think there are people around Corbyn, so I'm thinking particular people, Andrew Murray, possibly Seamus Milne, who used to be, until very recently, in the case of Andrew Murray, a member of the Communist Party, and he's not the only person in Corbyn's inner circle who that applies to. And do you think there are people in Corbyn's inner circle who are fundamentally not Democrats, is what I was trying to get at?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, they are not Democrats. And if you look at how they deal with internal dissent in the party, if you look at Emily Thornberry now, who can hardly be accused of not having been loyal to the leader, right?
Yeah.
If someone like her is now facing the motion because she dared to challenge the party line on Brexit, or you have someone like Alistair Campbell, who is like, the prototype of a loyalist Labour member for many, many decades, having been expelled because he didn't feel that he could vote for Labour in the European election. That is pretty close to Stalinism and how they live with internal dissent. And you see that stemming not just from Corbyn himself, but indeed from the individuals that you just mentioned.
I mean, just how dangerous do you think a Corbynite government would be, as in kind of for the stability of Britain?
Very dangerous. It would be very dangerous because this man has spent all of his career basically meeting with mortal enemies, not just of the Jewish people, but the British people. Right? That was, yes, he met with Hamas, but he also met with the IRA. He dined with Holocaust deniers, but he also denied genocide on the Balkan and slammed NATO intervention. He sits on Russian state TV, on Iranian state TV, on Qatari state TV, and slams the West and the system that is giving him the freedom of speech to do all of that. So he is inherently not a liberal Democrat, and a Corbyn government would be a threat to liberal democracy in Britain.
I mean, I guess you kind of hinted this already, but if Corbyn does become Prime Minister and forms a government, do you think that his regime and his supporters could try and erode some of the kind of like foundation blocks of our kind of tolerant liberal democratic society?
I'm not sure about. I'm not even sure they would need to do that, because just the very fact that we would have someone like him with that ideology and these connections in charge of the country, basically the own intelligence community being terrified of sharing critical information with him and our allies, shutting us out from the conversation. I mean, that in itself would erode democracy and the delicate balance of power that we have. And I'm not sure many people really appreciate the fact, but I don't know if you've seen this already, but the Daily Telegraph reported it today that the Iranian-backed Hezbollah was storing explosives in London for potentially a terrorist attack or whatever else they needed it for. But this is a group that Jeremy Corbyn described as his friends, that he invited to events, that he spoke alongside with, that he actually marched alongside with. And just to think about this very fact is absolutely terrifying. And I would say is unseen since the Second World War. Yeah.
When you say unseen since the Second World War, in a European context or in a British context?
In a Western European context. I mean, we see surges of nationalism and racism in Eastern Europe, but I would definitely say on that level, if he were ever to become Prime Minister, on that level, it would be the first since the Second World War in a Western European country.
I mean, do you think of Corbynism as a kind of fundamental break from the norms of British politics, or do you think that there was always that? Obviously, there was always that element there, but do you think that element has been dragged into the mainstream, or was that element already discussed to some extent in the mainstream?
You mean if he would mainstream his extremist ideology, if he would change the landscape of is that what you?
Yeah, I mean, it's more does the ideology that Corbyn represents, i.e. the kind of being critical of Western liberal democracy, is that something which has never been in the mainstream British politics before, or do you think there's kind of like earlier examples we can draw on?
Well, I think we've already seen some kind of a normalization here. You know,
Yeah.
if you look at I mean, we basically, it's barely a day goes by without Labour being confronted by accusations of anti-Semitism, and how many people are just ready to sweep this aside and dismiss this as an Israeli conspiracy or plot to unseat the leader. This just shows you how normalized this has already become, and in that sense, how already he changed the threshold of what you would regard as being completely unacceptable to be elected to public office. Because normally, you know, in a stable liberal democracy, you would say that someone like him, with a record of his, would be completely excluded from ever holding any public life. You know, you would say, like, this is where hate ends, this is where we stand up, and this is where we say no to racism. But because he has convinced so many people that this is actually not the case, and that he's a victim of a conspiracy and a ploy to unseat him, he has already done a lot of damage in the sense that he's normalised racism and anti-Semitism in particular.
I mean, do you think that really Corbyn should have been chucked out of the Labour Party by the quote-unquote moderates a long time ago, as in the sense that if someone in the Conservative Party held the same views as he did about any minority, or gave the impression of holding the same views, they would be in big trouble, I imagine. I mean, do you think that he should never have been allowed to remain in the Labour Party in the first place?
Yes, I do, and you know, I think we are now at this point where it's a very simple choice these people have, right? If they want to remain in the Labour Party, and they don't want to campaign for a racist, because that's what they do every time they knock on the doorstep and ask people to vote Labour. As long as Jeremy Corbyn remains the leader of the Labour Party, they are complicit in what's going on. So they either have the choice of removing him internally and retaking the Labour Party, or do what some of their honourable colleagues have already done and leave the Labour Party and say, this is no longer my party, it's led by racists, he's supported by a bunch of other races, and we don't want to have anything to do with it. This would have been the honourable thing to do. But as it looks to me right now, there isn't a lot of appetite to remove him from office, and there is also not a lot of appetite from any Labour MPs to leave the party over this. So what they basically essentially do is they are complicit in what's happening at the leader's office.
I mean, turning specifically to anti-Semitism, I mean, there's been polling by the Jewish Chronicle newspaper which says that a clear majority of British Jews think that Corbyn personally is an anti-Semite. A significant proportion would consider leaving the UK if he became Prime Minister. I mean, just how damaging do you think a Corbyn government would be to the British Jewish community?
It would absolutely devastate that relationship. It's already been damaged to a point where I'm not quite sure if the Labour Party, as it was, could ever really rebuild what has already been destroyed. There's so much been destroyed since Corbyn took office in 2015.
Yeah.
I don't see much trust left in the community, and I also don't see any trust whatsoever in the ability of the party to sort this out by themselves. A lot of Jewish groups are now obviously putting their faith into the investigation by the Equalities Watchdog to see what comes up there. They can legally enforce some recommendations, that kind of stuff. We'll need to see where this goes. But I think a Corbyn government would be an existential threat to Jewish life. You can't really see it any other way.
Yeah. I mean, you mentioned, obviously, that Labour is being investigated by the EHRC. I mean, if it came up with negative findings and with fierce criticism, do you think that could be enough for Labour moderates to turn around and say, you know, thus far or no more? Or do you think they're so far gone that they'll continue to keep their head in the sand and continue to back Corbyn, or at least accept Corbyn?
At this point, I fear that this would actually be the case, because, you know, there are so many things that already happened where you would think, as a responsible citizen, that this should be a red line. This should have been the red line. And every time the news break of another anti-Semitism scandal, you would think like, okay, this should now actually be enough. Enough is enough, and it's never enough. They always find a reason to stay and give you another line about fighting back from the inside. I don't really think it would change anything. I think at this point they will stick with Corbyn and they will fight the next election with him.
Yeah. Well, Julie, it's been a real pleasure. Thank you very much for your time.